You'll do as I say. This side of the rope is for the ceremony party. Civilians go back out the way you came. Now, I won't ask twice." The words came before anything else, before the hall had a shape, before there was light on the folded flags at the stage, or the squared ranks of folding chairs, or the small table near the podium where a cased metal waited under a square of dark cloth. The words came first, the way they always do. A young man's voice, pitched to carry, certain of its own authority, filling a room that had not yet decided what kind of morning it was going to be. Corporal Tyler Rennick stood at the velvet rope with his chin up and his thumbs hooked in his belt, 22 years old and sure of the 12 feet of floor he had been given to guard. The base theater was 1 hour from a decoration ceremony, chairs in ranks, a color detail forming near the wings, 200 seats that would fill with families and sailors, and one reserved row at the front with its cards turned face down, and a single chair at the center of that row that meant more than the rest, though no one had turned its card over yet to see why. The woman on the other side of his rope was not in uniform. Dark suit, plain and well cut. A visitor lanyard, no jewelry. A watch on her left wrist, turned inward so the face lay against the pulse. She was perhaps 46, though she carried her stillness in a way that made age beside the point. She had been standing quietly at the edge of the staging area, looking at the stage and the cased metal and the empty chair, and she had not heard him the first time because she had been somewhere else entirely, some private country a decade back and half a world away. "Understood," she said. One word. She turned to go. She turned too slowly for him. That was all it took. Not defiance. She was already moving, already stepping back toward the aisle. But she moved without hurry, squared and unbothered, her eyes finding the exits and the stage before they found his face, and the calm of it landed on Rennick like a challenge he had to answer. He stepped in around the rope. He told her to move, and when her pace did not change, when she simply kept turning at the speed of a woman who had never in her life been rushed by a man with a raised voice, he brought the back of his hand across her cheek. The sound of it carried to the third row. Her head turned with the blow. It moved her that far and no farther. She brought it back to level the way a compass needle comes back to north, without effort, without argument, without any of the flinch or fury a struck person is supposed to show. Her hand did not come up. Her voice did not come out. She stood with the print of his knuckles blooming red along her cheekbone and looked at him with eyes that had gone very flat and very patient and said nothing at all. She did not touch the mark. She only breathed, once, slow, and let her weight settle back over her heels and filed the young man away somewhere behind her eyes. It was not a decision to do nothing. People would say later that she had done nothing, and they would be wrong. She had done the hardest thing a person with her training can do, which is to hold still on purpose, to keep 100 trained responses leashed behind a calm face, because letting even one of them off the leash in a room full of families would turn a corporal's bad morning into something no one could walk back. She had made that choice in less than a second, the way she had made harder ones in less time than that, and then she had folded her hands and let him keep his rope. Near the side aisle, a man in Navy service dress went still. Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Thorne was 50 years old and had spent 30 of those years learning to read the thing he was looking at now. He had a folded program halfway to his pocket. He did not finish the motion. He knew that stillness. He had seen it in exactly 2 kinds of people in his life, and one of those kinds was long dead, and the other kind did not come to base theaters in dark civilian suits to be slapped by corporals. He set the program down on the nearest chair and watched and did not call out, because some part of him already understood that whatever was happening in this hall was hers to run, not his. A young sailor near the guest tables, Seaman Mara Quinn, 23 months to the fleet, had started forward the instant the hand landed. Rennick waved her back without even looking. Quinn stopped, her face open with the plain shock of the young, and watched the woman in the dark suit step calmly back outside the rope, touch nothing, and fold her hands in front of her. The cheek was already darkening. The eyes stayed level. It was the woman's stillness, not the blow, that Quinn would not be able to forget. The way she had absorbed a thing like that, without spending a single drop of herself on it. Rennick, satisfied, turned back to his rope and forgot her face. To him, it was already over. A civilian had been kept in her place, and the morning could proceed the way he had decided it would. A corporal had struck a woman across the face in a hall built to honor courage, and she had answered by folding her hands and standing perfectly still, while the one man in the room, who recognized what that stillness meant, kept his silence and waited to see what she would do with it. The hall began to fill. Families came in twos and threes, grandparents and children in stiff good clothes, sailors in their whites finding seats near the back and pretending not to check their own reflections in the dark windows. The color detail dressed its line near the wings, under the eye of a gunnery sergeant, who ran the room the way some men run everything they touch, as a fief to be defended. Gunnery Sergeant Dale Merrick was 39, broad through the shoulders, and had decided a long time ago that the world divided cleanly into people who belonged and people who had to be managed. He had put Rennick on the rope because Rennick could be trusted to keep the second kind moving. The two of them had that in common, a certainty that never once in the next hour would trouble itself to check whether it was right. Diana Calloway stood at the back with her cheek reddening and read the room the way she read everything, which was completely and without appearing to. 6 exits, 2 she would use: the stage, the flag party, the podium, the cased metal on the little table, the reserved row and its face-down cards, the gunnery sergeant who owned the floor, and the corporal who owned the rope, the master chief along the wall who had gone still, and whom she had clocked in the first 10 seconds, and whom she had decided not to acknowledge, because acknowledging him would cost him something in this room, and she never spent other people's credit. So she was already moving when the old man went down. He was a retired chief, come to watch a grandson decorated, and he grayed out between the rows without a word. One moment upright, the next folding at the knees, a paper program sliding from his hand and fanning across the floor. The rows around him froze in the useless way rooms freeze, half standing, looking to one another, to be the one who moved first. Calloway was on a knee beside him before the second row had finished turning. Collar open. 2 fingers laid along the side of his throat, her free hand already tipping his chin, clearing his airway, her whole body arranged around the problem with an economy that had no wasted motion in it anywhere. Her voice came out flat and even and carrying, counting first, and then giving orders to strangers as if she had every right to. He's breathing. Pulse 120 and thready. There's an automatic defibrillator on the wall by the left exit. Red cabinet below the fire panel. Bring it. You. A nod to a sailor gone white. Call it in. Tell them cardiac. Tell them conscious and breathing. Go now. A hospital corpsman 2 rows back came alive at the sound of orders, given by someone who plainly knew how to give them, and reached her side, and between the two of them they had the old chief flat, and monitored, and his color climbing back before the red cabinet had even finished its short journey up the aisle. Calloway was already easing away from him, letting the corpsman have the space, wiping her hand slowly down her slacks, unbothered, retreating into the background of her own competence, the way water goes back to being still. 3 rows up, the old chief's grandson, The sailor the whole family had driven a day and a night to see decorated, had gone pale watching his grandfather fold to the floor, and it was the woman in the dark suit who had put a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder for 1 second on her way past, not breaking stride, and told him his grandfather would be fine and that he should go and sit with him now. He went. He would remember much later that a stranger had known his grandfather would live before the corpsman had even reached them, and had spent 1 full second of a crisis reassuring a frightened kid she had never met and would never see again. He would not learn until the end of the morning who that stranger was or what it had cost her to be standing in that hall at all. Quinn stared. The woman had named the cabinet, red, below the fire panel, left exit, before anyone in the hall had turned to look for it. She had walked into a room she had never been in, and she had known where the defibrillator lived before she knew where the restrooms were. Thorne, closer now, watched with something that was very near reverence, and said nothing, because saying it was not his to do. Rennick arrived late to the crisis in his own cordon. He thanked the corpsman. He looked at the woman in the dark suit, standing quietly at the edge of it, and decided, in the way certain men decide things, that she was a nurse, or a spouse who used to be a nurse. Some soft civilian competence to be acknowledged, and then filed away where it could not complicate his morning. "All right, ma'am," he said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "You've had your excitement. Back behind the line. We've got professionals for this." She let it stand. She looked at him with that same flat patience, read the whole of him in a glance, and found nothing in it worth spending a word on, and stepped back behind the line. The old chief's grandson would be decorated in an hour. The old chief would be fine. That was the only part of the exchange that mattered to her, and she let the rest go the way she let almost everything go, without appearing to carry it at all. She had restarted a stranger's heart between 2 rows of folding chairs, and let a corporal call her a spouse with a nice hobby, and the only 2 people in the hall who had seen what she truly did were a master chief and a seaman who could not yet have said why they could not stop staring. The detail closed around the story it had already written. Merrick gathered his men in the wings and briefed them low, and in the briefing, the woman in the dark suit became the Wanderer, an unlisted civilian who had made a scene, twice now, and needed watching. Keep her back. No strays near the front. The men laughed the small laugh of men agreeing with the boss, and the label stuck, and from that moment, they watched her the way a store watches a shoplifter, with the particular contempt reserved for a problem that has not yet had the decency to leave. One of them, a lance corporal, drifted to a spot along the back wall from which he could keep her in view, arms folded, chin set, performing a vigilance the morning did not require. By the time the hall was half full, the story had hardened into something the detail could believe in completely. The Wanderer had made a scene. The Wanderer had put her hands on a sick man. That was how one of them told it to another. The defibrillator and the carotid, and the count all sanded down into, she wouldn't leave the guy alone. It is a remarkable thing, how fast a room can build a person out of nothing and then resent her for not matching the blueprint. Calloway watched her own reputation get assembled from across the hall, brick by wrong brick, and she let it go up, because arguing with it would only have poured concrete around the base of it. Quinn would not let it go. She found a folding chair and a paper cup of water, and carried both to the back where the woman stood, and set the chair down, and offered the cup. Calloway took it. She did not take out a phone. There was no phone. Her hand stayed empty and easy. The watch turned inward against her wrist. She drank the water in small, measured sips, and she thanked the young sailor quietly, by name, because she had read the name tape without seeming to. "Thank you, Seaman Quinn." "Ma'am, that man. You should sit." You should have someone look at your face. It's already looked at, Calloway said, with the ghost of something warm under the flatness. Sit down for a minute yourself. You've been on your feet since before the sun. Merrick crossed the floor and drew Quinn aside by the elbow and told her, in a voice meant to be overheard, to stop fraternizing with the civilian who had assaulted a Marine's patients. Quinn went back to her tables, with her ears burning and her jaw tight. Calloway watched it happen and said nothing, and was gentle in the only way left to her, which was to make sure her eyes never once made the young sailor feel she had done anything wrong. Her gaze rested a moment on the front row, one reserved chair at the center, a card turned face down on the seat, the cased metal on its little table under its square of dark cloth, the colored detail forming up beside it. She knew precisely what that chair was for. She knew whose name was printed on the card lying face down on it. And she drank her water at the back of the room and said not one word about any of it. They had given her a nickname, a warning, and a seat by the door, and not one of them had thought to walk to the front of their own hall and turn over the card on the empty chair to read the name printed there. If you have ever watched a room decide who matters before it has bothered to learn a single true thing about anyone in it, then you already know how this hall felt, and you know why stories like this one are worth staying for. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay to the end, because the card on that chair is going to be turned over, and the whole room is going to have to look at what was written on it the entire time. The exclusion went from spoken to official the moment it found a piece of paper to live on. Merrick wanted the woman in the dark suit accounted for, so he sent Quinn to check her against the printed manifest, and Quinn came back and reported, unhappily, that there was no Calloway on the list. There was no Calloway on the list because the honoree's identity had been held under a protective designation and entered by the command, not the event staff. The blank line was not an absence, but a precaution, the kind that gets built around people whose past work makes their names worth protecting. Merrick did not know that, and did not care to. To him, a blank line was proof. By his procedure, the woman was an intruder, and procedure was the only god he had ever served. So he wrote it up. He drafted a security statement in a firm, square hand, and had Rennick sign it, and on the page, the morning quietly changed its shape. The unlisted civilian had crossed the cordon. She had resisted. She had been, in the clean, bloodless language of such documents, controlled. The backhand across her face became a hand raised to fend her off. The woman who had folded her hands and stood still became combative. Merrick briefed the installation duty officer that there was a disruptive guest in a dark suit who should be walked out, courteously but firmly, before the ceremony stepped off, and the duty officer, who had a flag officer inbound and 100 things to track and no reason on earth to doubt a gunnery sergeant, nodded and made a note. Thorne saw the folder change hands and cross the floor. He came up on Merrick's shoulder and spoke low, the way one senior man speaks to another when he is trying to save him from himself. "Gunny, that woman by the back door, you want to stop what you're doing, right now, and stand her up front. I'm telling you plain, one old salt to another. Walk it back." Merrick did not even turn all the way around. "Appreciate it, Master Chief. I've got my haul handled." "You don't," Thorne said quietly. "You just don't know that yet." But Merrick had already moved on, and there it was, the one lever Thorne could not pull. He knew who she was. He could have said it, 4 words, and ended the whole thing where it stood. But he had served in her world long enough to know her iron rule, the one every operator like her lived by. You do not pull rank for yourself. Not ever. Not to be seated. Not to be spared. Not to be saved a slap. If he announced her over her head, in a hall, to win her an apology she had not asked for, He would be breaking her code for her, and she would never forgive it, and he would deserve the not forgiving. So he stepped back, jaw set hard enough to ache, and let her run her own silence, and hated every second of it. From the back of the hall, Calloway read all of it without hearing a word. She read the duty officer's posture and the folder under his arm, and the glance he sent toward her and away. She understood that she was about to be walked out of her own ceremony. She squared the paper cup on the seat of the chair Quinn had brought her, lining its base to the edge of the metal with 2 fingers, and folded her hands again, and decided, the way she had decided 100 harder things on darker mornings, with far more than her dignity on the line, to let this morning arrive wherever it was going. In the space of 10 minutes, a corporal slap had become, on the official record, her assault, and the only man in the hall who could have stopped it had just been told, politely, to enjoy the ceremony. Master Chief Thorne stood against the side wall and let himself remember, because there was nothing else left to do with what he knew. 12 years ago, he had been a chief in a community that does not advertise itself, and there had been a name that moved through that community the way weather moves, a task unit commander, callsign Halyard, who had taken a unit into a strait that has no unclassified name and brought most of them home. He had never served on her boat. He had not needed to. In a world that small, you learn the shape of certain people from the space they leave in a room when they walk out of it, and he had learned hers from the way grown operators went quiet when the call sign came up, and from the particular way they went quiet, not the hush around a hero, but the hush around a debt that can never be repaid, and everyone in the room knowing it. He had spent 12 years not saying it out loud, and now here she was, in a dark suit, being called the Wanderer by a gunnery sergeant with a clipboard, and it was very nearly more than a man could stand to watch. But he honored her code, because honoring it was the only tribute she would accept, and so he crossed the floor one more time, not to save her, only to stand near her. And he did not salute, because she would have hated a salute in that hall, more than she had hated the slap. He said the call sign low, once, the way you say a name at a graveside. Didn't expect to see Halyard standing by the door. Something in her face eased by a single degree. "I'm just here to stand for a minute, Master Chief," she said. "Let it be." "Yes, ma'am." A pause that cost him. "That corporal is 22 and thinks the rope makes him tall," she said. "Let it be, Elias." He almost smiled at that, at the fact that she had his first name, that she had probably had it within a second of seeing his face. He asked after nothing more, because she had told him to let it be, and letting it be was the whole of what she had asked of anyone that day. She asked after his knees instead, and his oldest boy, who she somehow knew had been at a service school, and she got the details exactly right, because she had a memory like a chart table, and she spent all of it on other people and none of it on herself. It was the most human she would let herself be in that hall, and she spent it on him, and it cost him something to receive it. He drifted back toward the wall after that, because standing too long beside her would only draw the detail's eyes to her, and drawing eyes to her was the one thing she had asked him not to do. But he set himself where he could see her, and he made himself a promise that whatever else happened in that hall, he would not leave the building until the room knew her name. It was the only part of her code he was willing to bend. He would not say it for her. He would honor that until his last day. But he could stand there and wait and be on his feet and squared away in the exact second that someone else finally said it out loud. At the podium, the MC tapped the microphone and announced that the presiding officer was inbound. The Vice Admiral's aircraft was on the ground, motorcade to the theater. And in the low talk that ran through the hall, the shape of the day finally showed itself to anyone paying attention. The Vice Admiral was named Ashby. 12 years ago, he had commanded the group that owned a certain task unit. He had spent those 12 years pushing to get an action declassified and an award upgraded, filing and refiling, waiting out the slow machinery of a country, deciding what it was finally allowed to say out loud. And when at last it was done, he had asked, personally, and not as a request that could be refused, to be the one to pin it. He had crossed most of an ocean to stand in this theater. He was 6 minutes from its doors. And at the wings, Merrick confirmed the plan to his duty officer with a small, satisfied nod. The woman in the dark suit goes out the side door, quietly, before the Admiral reaches the podium. Clean hull. No loose ends. Nothing to embarrass the command in front of a 3-star. The one flag officer in the fleet who had crossed an ocean to put this medal around this woman's neck was 6 minutes out, and a gunnery sergeant had just given the order to have her gone before he arrived. If your stomach is turning at that, good. That is the feeling that means you are still awake to how wrong a room can be while it is congratulating itself on its order. Subscribe and stay with it, because those 6 minutes are going to run out, and when that door opens, everything this hall thinks it knows is going to be rearranged in front of it. There is a night that lives under all of this, and it is time to tell it. 12 years ago, in a contested strait with a name this account will not use, a coastal freighter sat dead in the water in the dark, with 12 hostages below her decks and armed men above them. Lieutenant Commander Diana Calloway was 34 years old, and the commander of the task unit sent to take the ship back. The sea was black and moving, a long swell running under a moonless sky, and the rigid hull boat came in on the freighter's shadow without lights, engines throttled down to a mutter. The hull ladder came up out of the water on their grapnels, and the darkened deck waited at the top of it. And on the net, her voice was the calmest thing in that whole ocean. Halyard, to all elements. Hostages are the mission. We do not leave that deck without them. On me. They went up the ladder into a night that turned hard almost at once. She led it, first hand over the rail, first onto the deck, moving into the dark of the superstructure while the boat fell away beneath them into the swell. Clearing the passageway down to the hostages, she took a wound high in the shoulder, a hard, sudden shock that spun her a quarter turn into the bulkhead, a gloved hand pressed flat against it, a jaw set against it, and not one syllable of it on the net, because a commander who lets the net hear her pain hands her people a reason to hesitate, and she would not give them that. She kept the assault moving. She got her element down to the hold, and the hold open. And then, the hardest arithmetic of that whole ocean, 12 frightened civilians, handed up out of the dark one at a time, passed, hand to hand, along a black passageway toward the boats, and she counted every single one of them by touch and by voice as they went, because counting was the whole of the job, and she would not lose the count, no matter what the night did to her shoulder. 11. 12. 12 people who had woken up that morning certain they would die on that ship, moving now toward the rail and the boats and the rest of their lives because of what a task unit did in the dark. Her shoulder had gone from shock to a deep grinding fire by then, the arm a half-second slower than it should have been, and she worked around it the way she worked around everything, folding the damage into the arithmetic and refusing to let it change the count. A commander does not get to be wounded until the mission says she may. She got the last civilian to the rail. She got her own people turning back toward the boats. She was already counting angles and shadows for the withdrawal, already doing the cold arithmetic of who stood where and what the deck still had left in it, when the deck decided to take one more thing from her before it would let her go. Petty Officer First Class Joel Barrera was 28 years old, and when the last stretch of open deck between the hostages and the boats became the most dangerous ground on Earth, he made himself the reason it could be crossed. He put himself in the gap, and he held it. And 12 people and one wounded commander went down the ladder to the boats because he stood where he stood and did not move. He did not come back up it. There was a silence on the net where his voice should have been, a silence Calloway felt in her chest before her mind would name it. And then there was a name that Diana Calloway has said to herself every single day since, in the small hours, the way other people say prayers. She had gone to him herself, part of the way, got a fist in his kit and pulled, because leaving him on that deck was a thing her body physically refused to do, wound or no wound, until the arithmetic she lived by finally caught up with her heart and told it the truth it had been holding out at arm's length. There is a particular arithmetic to that moment that no one who has not stood in it will ever fully understand, and no one who has stood in it ever entirely sets back down. She made the call. She got the living to the boats, and she came down the ladder last, the way she had gone up first, and she did not look at the water, because she already knew exactly what the water had kept. She did not talk about that night. Not once, in 12 years. When the action was finally pulled up out of its classification and the award was upgraded to the second highest thing the country can give for valor, she did not ask for a ceremony, and she did not want the medal for herself. She would have mailed it to a drawer if they had let her. She let herself think one honest sentence, standing there at the back of the hall, with a corporal's handprint fading on her cheek, and the whole day pressing on her like water at depth. She had not come to be seen, or seated, or saluted. She had come so that Joel Barrera's name would be read aloud, once, in a room full of the living, before she got too old to be there to hear it. And even that one small thing, a gunnery sergeant with a clipboard had very nearly taken from her at the door. The woman a detail had nicknamed the Wanderer was the reason 12 hostages went home to their families, and the reason a medal sat cased on a table at the front of that room. And the only name she wanted spoken in the hall that morning was not her own. The ceremony was about to step off, and the detail moved to remove her before it could. The MC called the hall to settle. 200 people found their seats. The color detail dressed its line. The guidons squared, the folded flags catching the stage lights. The reserved front row waited with its one empty chair and its face-down card. And Merrick, watching the clock, watching the aisle, nodded Rennick toward the back of the room. Get her out now, before the Admiral, before the doors, before anything could go wrong in front of a flag officer. Rennick crossed the floor and took Diana Calloway by the upper arm. It was not a guide. It was a grip, a wrench, sudden and hard, meant to turn her and march her toward the side door, hard enough that heads came up 3 rows deep and a chair scraped loudly against the floor. His old line came again, quieter now and uglier for it, delivered close to her ear so only she would hear the shape of it. I told you. You'll do as I say. Let's go. Out the side. Quietly. Against the wall, Quinn lifted her phone and began to record before she had decided to, the way your hand snatches at something falling off a shelf. Over the exit, a security camera held the same frame from above, patient and unblinking. Families turned in their seats. A grandmother put a hand to her mouth. The hall's attention swung toward the back of the room like a compass needle finding a new north, and for the first time that morning, the detail's tidy story was happening in front of everyone at once. Calloway let herself be turned. She did not set her feet. She did not tense. She looked at the young corporal whose fingers were dug into her arm, and she was not angry, and she was not afraid, and she gave him, for the first time that whole morning, the smallest smile, the one her operators had learned to fear more than any raised voice, because it was the smile of someone who has already seen exactly how a thing ends and is only waiting, with enormous patience, for everyone else in the room to catch up. You should let go of my arm, Corporal, she said gently. For your sake. Not mine. And behind Rennick, unseen by him, the doors at the back of the hall opened. A protective detail came through them first, quiet men who moved like they measured the room. Then an aide. Then a man with 3 stars on his shoulder, and the temperature of the whole room changed before a single word had been said. Row by row, from the back forward, the hall began to come to its feet. Not on any order, but the way a field of grain leans all at once when the wind finally reaches it. A corporal had wrenched a Navy Cross recipient toward a side door by the arm, in front of 200 witnesses and 2 cameras, and behind him, the doors had opened, and the room had begun to stand. Vice Admiral Warren Ashby was 57 years old, and he had been in more rooms of consequence than most men see in 10 lives, and he did not waste a motion in any of them. He came through the doors and did not wave the hall down. His eyes went past the reserved front row, past the podium, past every place a man of his rank is supposed to look first, and found the side aisle, and the woman in the dark suit with a young Marine's hand clamped hard on her arm. And something in his face closed, quietly and completely, like a heavy door easing shut on oiled hinges. He did not go to the podium. He walked toward her, and the aide at his shoulder, reading the room the way aides to admirals learn to read rooms, lifted his voice and said the 4 words that stopped Tyler Rennick's blood in his body. "Attention on deck." The hall snapped to its feet as one. Sailors, families, the color detail, Merrick, all of it up and rigid in an instant, the sound of 200 people standing at once rolling through the theater like a wave hitting a hull. And in the middle of that, frozen, was a 22-year-old corporal, with his hand still gripping the arm of the woman the 3-star admiral was walking directly toward. Rennick's certainty, the thing that had run his whole morning, drained out of him from the top down. Ashby reached the podium and did not rush. He set both hands on its edges. He let a silence come down over the hall that was heavier than any order he could have shouted, and he held it past the point of comfort, held it until it filled every corner of the room and pressed on every person in it, until even the children understood that something enormous was happening that they didn't yet have the words for. Then he leaned to the microphone, and he spoke very quietly. "Take your hand off that officer." Rennick let go as though the arm had turned to fire. Ashby straightened. He rendered honors. Deliberate, formal, unmistakable. A vice admiral of the United States Navy squaring away to a woman in a plain civilian suit. And then he spoke to the hall, in a voice pitched not to impress, but only to be understood, and to be remembered by everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. "Attention to the citation. The officer that some of you have spent the last hour moving toward the door is Captain Diana Calloway, United States Navy. In a place I will not name in this room, on a night that most of you will never hear the whole of, she was called Halyard. She is the reason 12 Americans came home to their families. She is also the reason one of ours did not. She has come here this morning to receive the Navy Cross. You will treat her accordingly, every one of you." He had crossed an ocean to say a name in that hall. It was never going to be the corporal's. Tyler Rennick heard Captain. He heard Halyard. He watched a vice admiral of the United States Navy render honors to the woman he had backhanded across the face 1 hour before. And his face went through the whole of it in the time it takes a hall to breathe. Confusion first. Surely a mistake. Surely the admiral meant someone else. Surely not the wanderer. Then disbelief. The woman in the dark suit. The nurse who used to be a nurse. The problem he had kept in her place. Then recognition. Arriving in pieces that fit together with a sound he could almost hear. The defibrillator cabinet she had named without looking. The Master Chief who had told him plainly to stand her up front. The blank line on a manifest that had been blank on purpose by people whose reasons were far above his understanding. And then, last, horror. The clean and total horror of a young man remembering his own open hand against her cheek, and then his fingers dug into her arm, both of those things done in front of 2 cameras and a flag officer, and everyone he had ever wanted to think well of him. Ashby did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A word to the duty officer, and Merrick's tidy statement was drawn back out of the folder it had been filed in. A nod, and the master-at-arms crossed the floor and came to a quiet stop at Rennick's elbow. Through all of it, Diana Calloway had not raised her hand, or her voice, or her rank. She had simply stood and let the truth do what the truth does when someone finally opens the door and lets it into the room. Around her, the hall was rearranging everything it thought it had known. The families who had watched a corporal strike a wanderer were now watching a vice admiral stand at honors before a Navy Cross recipient, and the 2 images would not fit inside the same frame, and every person in that room was being forced, in real time, to throw the first one out. The lance corporal who had watched her from the back wall for an hour sat down slowly without being told to, as if his legs had stopped believing in the assignment, and the woman at the center of all of it stood exactly as she had stood by the door, squared, still, patient, as though the only thing that had changed in the entire room was that it had finally caught up to her. There was no shout and no scuffle, only a 3-star admiral saying a woman's name into a silent hall, a corporal's hand falling away from her arm, and a master-at-arms stepping softly to his side, while the metal that had caused all of it still sat cased under its square of cloth on the little table at the front of the room. After that, the truth came apart in the details' hands very fast. The duty officer laid Gunnery Sergeant Merrick's security statement on the table beside Seaman Quinn's video and the still frame from the exit camera, and the 3 of them did not agree, and paper always loses that argument. The hand raised to fend her off was, on the recordings, a backhand delivered to a woman who was already turning to leave. The combative civilian was a woman who folded her hands and stood still, while a man's knuckles bloomed red across her face. And once the first stone turned, the others turned with it. Within the hour, there surfaced 2 earlier incidents that Merrick's detail had handled. 2 other civilians moved along a little too hard. 2 other tidy statements, written in the same firm, square hand. A pattern is only invisible until someone holds a light to the first page of it. After that, it is the easiest thing in the world to read. Corporal Rennick was placed under charges, assault, and the false official statement he had signed his name to. Gunnery Sergeant Merrick was relieved of his detail on the spot. His men pulled, and his conduct opened to an investigation that would not be brief and would not be gentle. It was not vengeance, and no one in the hall mistook it for vengeance. It was the plain arithmetic of what a country owes a person it has decorated for valor, set against what 2 men had chosen to do to her in the hour before it could, and the arithmetic did not balance in their favor. Merrick tried, once, to hold his ground. He began a sentence about procedure, about an unlisted guest, about a detail doing its job, about a hall that had to be kept secure, and Ashby let him get most of the way through it before he stopped him with nothing more than a look and a single quiet sentence. He told the gunnery sergeant that procedure was the excuse small men reached for when they wanted permission not to look at a person. That a hall could be perfectly orderly and completely without honor at the very same time. And that Merrick had just spent an hour proving it in front of 200 witnesses and a flag officer. Then he was finished with him. He did not spend another word. Some men you correct. Some men you simply set down. Then Vice Admiral Ashby did something that had nothing to do with paperwork. He learned that it had been a 20-year-old seaman, 3 months to the fleet, who had brought the woman in the dark suit a chair, and then a cup of water, and then, when it mattered most, a camera. He asked Seaman Mara Quinn to stand. "Seaman Quinn," he said, and the whole hall turned to look at her, and she went scarlet to the roots of her hair and stood anyway, which was the point. You were the only person in this hall who treated her like a human being before you knew she was a legend, before there was anything in it for you. That is the entire job. That is the whole of it, from the day you raise your hand to the day they hand you your flag. I hope you will still remember this morning on the day you outrank me. Here is the thing worth sitting with, before the medal and the wall and the quiet end of it. A woman was struck across the face in a room built to honor courage, called an intruder, written up as the aggressor, and dragged toward a side door by the arm. And 1 hour later, a nation draped its second highest award for valor around her neck, and read a dead man's name into a silence so complete you could have heard it in the parking lot. If that turn is the reason you come to stories like this one, then you already belong here. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay through the last minute of this one, because the last minute is the reason she came at all. They walked Diana Calloway to the front of the hall at last, to the chair with her name on the card, and someone finally turned that card face up, and it had been her name the entire time. Ashby lifted the square of cloth from the little table. He draped the Navy Cross, 2 steady hands lowering the ribbon from above, and then the weight of it settling at her throat. And he read the citation, and he kept it short, the way the real ones always are. A contested straight. The year, spoken plainly, 2014. 12 hostages recovered from a hijacked vessel in darkness. A wound held so the mission could be finished. And then, because she had asked him to, and because it was the only thing she had ever wanted from that room, or any room like it, he read one more name into the microphone. Petty Officer First Class Joel Barrera. And the whole hall stood for it. And this time, no one had to be told to rise. The old chief from the front rows, back on his feet and steady now, stood the straightest of anyone, one hand flat over his heart, and his grandson's hand gripped hard in the other. Across the hall, men who had spent the better part of an hour in easy contempt of a woman in a dark suit now stood at rigid attention and could not quite meet her eyes, and she gave them the grace of not making them. She looked instead at the space the citation had conjured, at the empty air where a 28-year-old ought to have been standing to hear his own name read aloud. The hall held the silence a long moment after the name, longer than protocol asked for. It was the finest thing that room had done all morning, and it had cost it nothing but the willingness, at last, to be quiet and to listen to a name it had never earned the right to forget. Later, when the theater had thinned and the families had gone, and the folding chairs stood empty in their slightly crooked ranks, Diana Calloway walked out to the memorial wall in the lobby, where the photographs of the fallen hung in their quiet rows under a single line of soft light. She found the one she had come 1,000 miles to stand in front of. And she stood there for 1 minute, no more and no less, with her hand flat over her own sternum and the Navy Cross at her throat. And she said nothing out loud, because everything worth saying to Joel Barrera she had already said 1,000 times in the dark, and he had heard all of it, and she knew that he had. Master Chief Thorne stood a respectful distance back, at parade rest, keeping a watch he had appointed himself and would not have surrendered to anyone. Seaman Quinn watched from the lobby doors and understood, dimly, and then all at once and completely, that she had seen the whole of something that morning that she would spend an entire career trying to be worthy of. And then Calloway squared her shoulders, the way she squared everything, and turned to go. At the lobby doors, her phone buzzed once against her hand, a message with no name attached to it, only a single coded line, and beneath it a grainy photograph of a stretch of coastline she knew the way she knew her own scars. Halyard, The Strait still owes a debt. Come to the Gulf of Aden. One name is still open. She read it once. She looked at the coastline in the photograph for a moment longer than she looked at the words, the way you look at a face you have not seen in years. Then she put the phone in her pocket, and she stepped out through the doors into a bright, hard morning, the calm on her face gone very slightly harder than it had been. A woman who had come to a hall to hear one name read aloud and was already reading the coordinates of the next debt the sea intended to collect. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.